Hey guys, tonight we explore the lives and legacies of the most notorious women in Roman history. The kind of women who shattered reputations, schemed their way into power, and left behind a trail of betrayal, murder, and scandal. From poisoning emperors to seducing generals and masterminding civil wars, these women weren't just dangerous, they were unforgettable. So before you get comfortable, as always, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if you enjoy our content. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes our stories are way too interesting, and we're still working on the boring ones. It's time now to dim the lights, turn on a fan for some background noise, and let's cover what we have for tonight together. Livia Drusilla. She outlived 4 heirs to the throne of Rome. Every single one of them stood between her son and the purple, and every single one of them died before their time. Coincidence has a shelf life. After the 3rd funeral, Rome stopped believing in it. Her name was Livia Drusilla, and for 52 years she was the most powerful woman the Roman world had ever seen, not because she screamed for it, not because she seized a sword, but because she understood something almost nobody else in her family did. Power in Rome wasn't taken. It was arranged. Quietly, patiently, over decades, if that's what it took. She was born in 58 BC into a family that bet on the wrong side of history and lost. Her father fought against Octavian, the man history would later call Augustus, and when that war ended, he fell on his own sword rather than be captured. Livia was a teenager, married off, fleeing through Italy with her first husband and an infant son, hiding from the very army led by the man she would one day marry. She reportedly walked through burning forests with her baby in her arms, close enough to the fighting to hear it. Remember that detail, because 6 years later, that fleeing teenage refugee would be standing in Octavian's palace as his wife. How does a woman go from fugitive to empress in 6 years? In Rome, the answer was always the same, because someone needed her to. Octavian saw her at a dinner party in 39 BC. She was married. She was pregnant with her 2nd child. None of that mattered. He divorced his own wife the same day their daughter was born, a daughter he'd essentially abandoned, and he pressured Livia's husband into divorcing her. Rome's priests were asked, with a straight face, to bless a marriage between a pregnant woman and a man who was not the father of the child she carried. They said yes. Everyone said yes to Octavian, even then. This is where most retellings of Livia stop and call it a love story. It wasn't. It was a merger. Livia came from one of Rome's oldest and most respected patrician families, the Claudii, and Octavian, for all his growing power, was still seen by the old aristocracy as an upstart, the grandnephew of Julius Caesar riding his adopted father's name to the top. Livia gave him legitimacy. He gave her a throne that didn't officially exist yet, because Rome hadn't decided it wanted an emperor. Together, over the next several decades, they built one anyway, and built it to look like it had always been there. She was extraordinary at this. While Octavian transformed himself into Augustus, first citizen of Rome, restorer of the Republic in name only, Livia transformed herself into the model Roman matron. She spun her own wool. She dressed modestly. She was praised by poets for her old-fashioned virtue in an era of scandal and excess. It was, historians now largely agree, a performance of extraordinary discipline, and it worked precisely because nobody could prove otherwise. But behind the modest wool and the quiet dinners, Livia was running something else entirely. A 40-year campaign to make sure her son from her first marriage, Tiberius, sat on the throne that Augustus never wanted to give him. Here's the problem she faced. Augustus had a daughter, Julia, from his first wife, and he adored her, in his way, enough to see her sons as his true heirs. He adopted his own grandsons, Gaius and Lucius, and groomed them from childhood to rule. Tiberius, Livia's son, was a brilliant general and an afterthought. Livia was not raising the heir. She was raising the spare, and she does not appear to have accepted that arrangement quietly. Watch what happens to everyone standing in Tiberius's way. Marcellus, Augustus's nephew and one-time favorite heir, died suddenly in 23 BC at 20 years old. Ancient historians whispered Livia's name even then. Agrippa, the general Augustus trusted to marry his daughter and produce heirs, died of illness in 12 BC, natural enough, on its own. Then Lucius, one of the 2 golden grandsons, died in Gaul in AD 2, at 19. Then Gaius, the other grandson, died in Lycia in AD 4 from a wound that shouldn't have killed him, a wound he suffered, oddly, right around the time rumors placed a mysterious illness sweeping through his household. For heirs, one after another, each death clearing the path a little further toward Tiberius. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing decades later, with his own axe to grind, it's true, states plainly that Livia was suspected of poisoning Gaius and Lucius to secure the succession for her son. Cassius Dio goes even further and lays a body count at her feet that includes Marcellus. Modern historians are more cautious. Disease was common. Wounds went septic. Ancient medicine killed plenty of healthy young men without any help. And Livia, more than anyone in Rome, understood the value of being blamed for things she never actually did, because the rumor of her ruthlessness kept people from testing her. But here's what isn't rumor. Here's what's fact. When Augustus lay dying in AD 14, the only person controlling access to his sickroom was Livia. The official account says she sent for Tiberius, who was traveling, and that father-in-law and son-in-law had one final conversation before Augustus passed. But another account, a darker one, repeated by Tacitus and Dio both, claims Augustus was already dead before Tiberius arrived, and that Livia kept the palace sealed, kept the streets calm, kept the news from breaking, until her son was close enough to Rome to seize the reins the instant the announcement went out. No gap, no opportunity for a rival to move first. A woman who had spent 40 years arranging Rome's future gave herself one final night to make sure nothing could go wrong on the last page. And there's one more story, the one that follows Livia into every retelling of her life, like a shadow she can't shake. Augustus, in his final years, is said to have secretly visited his exiled grandson Agrippa Posthumus, the last surviving direct heir, banished to a remote island for his temper and instability, with a companion, reconciling, considering restoring him to the succession. If that visit really happened, it would have blown apart everything Livia had built. Days after Augustus died, before Tiberius had even formally taken power, a centurion arrived on that island and executed Agrippa Posthumus on the spot. Nobody could produce the order. Tiberius denied giving it. Livia was never directly named. But the boy who stood between her son and an uncontested throne was dead within days of the one man who might have protected him. Tiberius became emperor. Livia did not stop. For the next 15 years, she ruled in every way but title. She held her own court. Senators came to her for favors before they went to her son. She was granted honors no Roman woman had ever received, praetorian guards, a seat among the priesthood, her own portrait on coins alongside the emperor's. Augustus, in his will, adopted her into his own family and gave her the name Julia Augusta, making her, on paper, as close to a co-ruler as Rome had ever seen. And Tiberius hated every second of it. He resented his mother's shadow the way only a man who owes everything to someone can resent them. He left Rome eventually, retreating to the island of Capri for the last decade of his reign, ruling by letter, seeing almost no one, and historians have long debated whether he was fleeing politics, fleeing paranoia, or fleeing her. When Livia died in AD 29, at the age of 86, Tiberius didn't attend the funeral. He didn't return to Rome. He vetoed her deification for over a decade, and only her great-grandson Claudius, the very family member everyone had once dismissed as a stuttering embarrassment, finally granted her the divine honors she'd spent her life engineering her way toward. So what do we actually know about Livia Drusilla? We know she took a fugitive's flight from a losing war and turned it into 50 years at the absolute center of power. We know that everyone who stood between her bloodline and the throne died young, died suddenly, or died conveniently, for heirs and one exiled grandson, an unbroken chain of bad luck that always broke in her son's favor. We know she controlled the most dangerous room in the world, the room where an old man was dying and an empire hung on who found out first. And we know that history couldn't decide whether to call her a devoted wife who built an empire beside her husband, or a woman who poisoned her way through an entire generation to put her son on a throne he was never supposed to inherit. Maybe the most Roman thing about Livia is that both of those stories are, in some sense, true. She built something extraordinary, and whatever she had to clear away to build it, she cleared without leaving fingerprints. She died an old woman, honored, deified, remembered for 2,000 years, and to this day, nobody can prove a single murder against her name. That, in the end, might be the most dangerous skill in Roman history. Not the poison, but the ability to make sure no one could ever prove you used it. Locusta. By the time Rome was done with her, she had killed an emperor, trained an assassin's apprentice on a slave, and been given a farm, a pension, and a staff of students by the most powerful family on earth as a reward. Her name was Locusta, and she may be the only person in Roman history whose murders were not a scandal. They were a service. Most of the women on this list were born into power and fought to keep it, or fought to seize it from someone else. Locusta came from nothing you could trace. Ancient sources say she was from Gaul, likely enslaved or of low status, and that she'd first been arrested and condemned for poisoning under Claudius, a common enough crime in a city where inheritance disputes and political rivalries often ended in a cup of wine that didn't sit right. She should have been executed. Poisoning in Rome carried the death penalty, and Locusta had apparently been caught more than once. Instead, someone in the palace remembered her name. That someone was Agrippina the Younger, Claudius's own wife, and the subject of our next chapter. And what Agrippina wanted from a condemned poisoner in AD 54 was very specific. She wanted her husband dead, quietly, in a way that looked natural, before he could change his mind about naming her son Nero as his heir instead of his biological son Britannicus. Roman gossip said Claudius had been softening toward Britannicus. Agrippina could not afford to wait and see if that softening turned into a new will. So Locusta was pulled out of her cell, not to be executed, but to be put to work. The poison she prepared for Claudius, according to Tacitus, was mixed into a dish of mushrooms, Claudius's favorite food, and one where a slightly off flavor could be blamed on nature rather than malice. It worked mostly. Claudius fell violently ill, vomited, and seemed for a moment like he might recover, which for Agrippina was its own kind of emergency. So the story goes that Claudius's own physician, bribed or coerced, finished the job with a poisoned feather, supposedly meant to help him vomit further, that instead delivered a second, fatal dose straight down his throat. Emperor Claudius was dead. Nero, 14 years old, was emperor of Rome. And Locusta, the condemned criminal who mixed the mushrooms, was not punished. She was protected. This is the detail that separates Locusta from every poisoner who came before her in Roman history. She didn't vanish into legend after one job. She became an institution. Nero kept her close. When Britannicus turned 14 himself, old enough, by Roman reckoning, to formally come of age and become a political threat to Nero's claim to the throne, poisoned heir or not, Nero decided he needed him gone too. He turned to the same woman. The first attempt, historians say, didn't work well enough. The poison Locusta prepared was too weak, and Britannicus survived the first dose, which sent Nero into a fury. He is said to have had Locusta beaten for the failure and threatened her with execution unless she produced something faster, stronger, undeniable. So she did, reportedly testing the new formula on a goat first, and when that wasn't fast enough for Nero's taste, testing it again on a young pig, watching the animal die almost instantly, before handing over a poison strong enough to kill a 14-year-old boy at a dinner table in front of dozens of witnesses. Britannicus collapsed at his own family banquet in AD 55, convulsing, unable to speak, dead within minutes. Guests reportedly froze in place, terrified to react before Nero did. Nero, without missing a beat, announced that Britannicus had simply suffered one of his epileptic fits, a condition he apparently did have, which gave the murder just enough cover to survive the moment. The body was cremated so quickly and with so little ceremony that ancient writers treated the haste itself as an admission of guilt. And Locusta, once again, wasn't punished. She was paid. Nero rewarded her with a country estate, immunity from prosecution, and, almost unbelievably, students. He reportedly sent young men to her to be trained in the art of poisoning, turning what had been a condemned woman's death sentence into a formal academy of assassination, operating with the emperor's blessing, teaching the next generation how to kill quietly and blame nature. Think about what that actually means. Rome had laws against poisoning going back centuries. The Lex Cornelia de Sicarius et Veneficis specifically criminalized it. and convicted poisoners could be executed or exiled. And yet here was a state-sanctioned poison school, funded by imperial favor, run by a woman the courts had already sentenced to death once. Locusta didn't escape Roman justice. She became more valuable to the people running Rome than Roman justice was. That tells you something about Nero's court that's easy to miss if you only focus on the murders themselves. It wasn't that violence happened in the shadows and everyone pretended not to notice. It's that violence became a resource, something with market value, something an emperor budgeted for the same way he budgeted for grain or gladiators. Locusta wasn't hiding. She had a farm. She reappears once more in the record, and it's almost darkly comic given everything that came before. In AD 68, Nero's own reign was collapsing. The Senate had turned against him, the legions were in revolt, and Nero, the boy she'd made an emperor and a murderer by proxy, found himself cornered, with soldiers coming to arrest him and a public that wanted him dead or worse. He asked Locusta for one final favor, a poison he could carry with him, a way out on his own terms if it came to that. She gave it to him. In the end, Nero didn't use it. He died by his own hand with help from a secretary, stabbing himself in the throat rather than face capture, the poison apparently going untested at the very last. But the fact that Nero's final request to anyone on Earth was a vial from Locusta tells you everything about what her name had come to mean inside that palace. She wasn't a servant. She was insurance. Locusta's story ends the way you'd expect a Roman story about a poisoner to end, badly, and not for her most obvious crime. When Nero died and Galba took the throne in the chaos of AD 68, the new regime went looking for everyone associated with the old one to make an example of. Locusta, protected for over a decade by two successive emperors, was finally arrested. Ancient sources describe her being paraded through the streets in humiliation before her execution, a public spectacle meant to signal that the old order, and everyone who'd profited from its cruelty, was finished. So who was Locusta, really? Not a queen, not an empress, not someone who ever sat near a throne. She was something rarer and in some ways more disturbing. Proof that Rome's worst impulses didn't require noble blood to thrive. All they required was a market. Someone wanted people dead quietly, and someone else was willing to supply exactly that, for a price that ran all the way up to a country estate and a school of students. Locusta never claimed to be anything other than what she was. She didn't dress it up in politics or maternal love or wounded pride the way some of the empresses on this list did. She sold a service, and two emperors bought it, and for over a decade it made her one of the most protected women in the entire Roman world. That's the part of her story that should actually unsettle you. Not that a poisoner existed in ancient Rome. Poisoners have existed everywhere, in every century. It's that Rome built an entire framework of impunity around her, because the people at the very top decided her particular skill was worth more than the law. She died the moment that protection ran out. Which means, in the end, Locusta's real employer was never Nero, or Agrippina, or the palace. It was power itself, and power, as every woman on this list eventually learned, changes its mind. Messalina. She married another man while her husband was still emperor, still alive, and still, technically, married to her. And she did it in public, with witnesses, with a wedding contract, while he was away at the port managing a grain shortage. That is not a rumor historians disagree about. That is the part of Messalina's story almost every ancient source agrees actually happened. The only real debate is why a woman with more power than almost anyone in the Roman world would risk everything on something so catastrophically public. Valeria Messalina was around 14 or 15 when she married Claudius in AD 38 or 39, a marriage arranged for political reasons, connecting her to the imperial family through blood on both sides, since she was related to Augustus through two different family lines. Claudius, at the time, was not yet emperor. He was the family embarrassment, a stammering, limping scholar that most of his own relatives had written off as unfit for public life, kept alive mostly because nobody saw him as a threat. Then, in AD 41, Caligula was assassinated by his own guard, and in the chaos that followed, the Praetorian Guard reportedly found Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace, terrified they'd come to kill him too. Instead, they declared him emperor. Overnight, the family joke became the most powerful man alive, and his teenage wife became Empress of Rome. Messalina moved fast. She used her position to protect her children's claim to the succession and to eliminate anyone she saw as a threat, and ancient historians, particularly Tacitus and Suetonius, describe a string of forced suicides, executions, and exiles carried out at her instigation throughout Claudius's reign, often against members of the imperial family itself who she viewed as rivals to her son Britannicus's future claim to the throne. One of the most infamous cases involved Julia Livia, Caligula's own sister and a niece of Claudius, exiled and eventually executed on charges of adultery that ancient sources suggest Messalina orchestrated out of jealousy or fear of her influence. Another target was Appius Silanus, a former consul, executed on Messalina's accusation after, according to the sources, he refused her advances, prompting her to fabricate a story that he'd tried to assassinate Claudius in a dream Claudius reportedly had, which the emperor apparently took seriously enough to act on. Whether that particular detail is exactly true or embellished by later historians hostile to Messalina, the pattern underneath it is consistent across every source. People who crossed her did not stay alive or in Rome for long. But the accusation that defines Messalina, the one that's followed her for 2,000 years, is about appetite rather than ambition. Roman writers, almost entirely male, almost entirely writing decades after her death, almost entirely working from a political culture that loved punishing powerful women with stories about their bodies, described Messalina as insatiable, promiscuous beyond any figure in Roman history. The historian Pliny the Elder tells a particularly infamous and almost certainly exaggerated story that she once competed against a well-known prostitute to see who could have more sexual partners in a single night, and won. Modern historians treat that story with enormous skepticism, and they're right too. It reads less like reportage and more like moral theater, a way of using Messalina's body as a symbol for Imperial Rome's broader anxieties about decadence and female power running unchecked. But even stripping away the most sensationalized claims, one episode survives even the most careful scrutiny, because it happened in front of too many witnesses to fully deny: her marriage to Gaius Silius. In AD 48, while Claudius was away overseeing the grain supply at Ostia, Messalina reportedly divorced him without his knowledge, or simply ignored the fact that she was still legally his wife, and married Gaius Silius, a strikingly handsome consul designate, in a full public ceremony complete with witnesses, a wedding contract, and celebrations inside the palace itself. Tacitus describes the scene in detail: the vows exchanged, the sacrifices made, guests attending, a banquet held, as though the reigning emperor simply didn't exist. Why would she do something this openly, this recklessly, this impossible to explain away later? Ancient historians offer a few competing theories, and none of them fully agree, which itself tells you how confused even contemporaries were by what happened. Tacitus suggests it may have been genuine infatuation combined with a kind of reckless boredom, a woman so used to getting away with everything that she stopped believing consequences applied to her. Others have speculated it may have been a political maneuver, that Silius intended to use the marriage as the foundation for a coup against Claudius, with Messalina either a willing partner in replacing her aging, increasingly erratic husband, or a woman who'd simply lost all sense of restraint after a decade of unchecked power. Whatever the motive, it was a catastrophic miscalculation. Claudius's advisors, particularly his freedman secretary Narcissus, who had his own reasons to want Messalina removed, rushed to inform the emperor the moment word reached them, framing the marriage explicitly as treason and the opening act of a coup. Claudius, notoriously indecisive in most matters, moved with unusual speed once convinced his life was actually in danger. Messalina fled to the gardens of Lucullus, reportedly trying to reach Claudius herself to plead her case, dragging her 2 children with her in a desperate attempt to appeal to him as a father rather than face him as an emperor who'd just been told his wife had married someone else in public. Narcissus, fearing Claudius might waver and forgive her the way he'd forgiven so much before, moved to make sure that meeting never happened. He sent a tribune and a group of soldiers to the gardens with orders to kill her before Claudius could change his mind. According to Tacitus, Messalina's mother was with her at the very end and reportedly urged her daughter to die by her own hand and preserve some dignity, offering her a dagger. Messalina apparently couldn't do it, frozen, unable to complete the act, until the tribune stepped forward and finished it himself. Claudius, told afterward that Messalina was dead, reportedly showed no visible emotion and simply asked for more wine. Rome's response afterward was its own kind of verdict. The Senate ordered a damnatio memoriae against her, an official erasure, striking her name and image from public monuments and records wherever they could be found, a punishment reserved for people the state wanted history to forget had ever mattered. It didn't work, obviously. 2,000 years later, we're still saying her name, which is its own strange irony, given that the entire point of a damnatio memoriae was to make sure nobody would. So what do we actually know about Messalina, once you strip away 2 millennia of moralizing? We know she used real power to eliminate real rivals, sometimes through fabricated charges that cost innocent people their lives. We know she orchestrated a public second marriage while legally still married to the Emperor of Rome, an act so brazen that historians still can't fully agree on the motive behind it. And we know that when the moment of consequence arrived, the same power that had protected her for years evaporated instantly, and she died in a garden, unable even to hold the knife meant to grant her a dignified end. Whether Messalina was Rome's most reckless empress or simply the most convenient villain for a culture that needed one, her name became shorthand for excess for the entire span of Western history that followed. A word, Messalina, that still shows up in some languages today as an insult for a woman seen as too sexually free. That's the part worth sitting with. Ancient Rome executed her. Roman politics erased her name from its monuments. And 2,000 years of history still couldn't stop saying it. Agrippina the Younger. She married her own uncle to get her son onto the throne of Rome. 5 years later, that son had her murdered, and reportedly walked into the room afterward to examine her body and comment on it, out loud, in front of witnesses. If you're looking for the single most ruthless political operator in the 1st century of the Roman Empire, most historians will eventually point you to the same name, Agrippina the Younger. Not because she was the cruelest, Rome had crueler people, but because she was, for a period of nearly 2 decades, arguably the most successful, engineering an outcome no woman in Roman history had managed before her. Putting her own son on the imperial throne through sheer persistence, alliance building, and, if the ancient sources are believed, murder. She was born into chaos and never fully escaped it. Her father, Germanicus, was one of Rome's most beloved generals, and her mother, Agrippina the Elder, was fiercely, publicly devoted to him. Devoted enough that when Germanicus died young under suspicious circumstances, possibly poisoned on the orders of a rival, Agrippina the Elder spent years accusing the Emperor Tiberius's allies of murder, a campaign that eventually got her exiled and, according to most accounts, starved to death in captivity. Agrippina the Younger grew up watching her mother destroyed for challenging imperial power directly and openly. She would not make that same mistake. Where her mother confronted, Agrippina the Younger maneuvered. Her brother Caligula became emperor in AD 37, and for a brief period Agrippina and her sisters were showered with honors, appearing on coins, granted privileges no Roman women had received before. It didn't last. Caligula's reign spiraled into paranoia and cruelty, and in AD 39 he accused Agrippina of conspiring against him alongside her brother-in-law, exiling her to a small island in circumstances chillingly similar to what would happen to her own daughter decades later, though that story comes further down this list. She reportedly had to carry the ashes of an executed co-conspirator back to Italy herself, cradled in her lap for the entire sea voyage, a punishment as much about humiliation as exile. She was recalled from exile in AD 41 after Caligula's assassination, when her uncle Claudius took the throne, the same Claudius married to Messalina, whose downfall we just covered. Agrippina spent the following years rebuilding her position patiently, marrying twice more, accumulating wealth, and keeping her young son Lucius, the future Nero, visible and connected at court, always one relationship away from relevance, never quite in position to matter yet. Messalina's catastrophic fall in AD 48 changed everything. Claudius needed a new wife, and Agrippina, his own niece, put herself forward as a candidate along with several others. Marriage between an uncle and niece was technically illegal under Roman law at the time, a serious taboo, not a formality, and Claudius had to have the Senate formally change the law to make the marriage possible. They did. Agrippina became empress in AD 49, and from that moment forward, her focus narrowed to a single, relentless goal: securing the throne for her son over Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. She moved methodically. She had Claudius adopt Nero formally in AD 50, making him legally equal in status to Britannicus despite being older and not blood-related to the emperor. She arranged Nero's marriage to Claudius's daughter Octavia, tying him even more tightly into the family line. She maneuvered political allies into key positions, including securing the Praetorian Guard command for a prefect loyal specifically to her rather than to Claudius. She had rivals removed, exiled, or executed on charges of treason or immorality. The same playbook Messalina had used before her, deployed now with even greater precision. And then, in AD 54, Claudius died. We already know, from the last chapter on Locusta, how ancient historians describe that death: a dish of poisoned mushrooms, a physician's poisoned feather delivering the finishing dose, and a poisoner pulled from a death sentence to make it happen. Tacitus states outright that Agrippina orchestrated it, motivated by fear that Claudius was preparing to favor Britannicus over Nero as he neared the end of his natural life, and unwilling to risk losing everything she'd built after years of careful maneuvering. Modern historians remain divided on how much of this is confirmed fact versus hostile tradition written under later, unfriendly regimes, but the timing, undeniably, could not have suited Agrippina's ambitions more perfectly. Nero became emperor at 16, and for roughly the first year of his reign, Agrippina effectively ruled through him, appearing beside him on coins, an honor no Roman empress had received before, reportedly sitting in on Senate meetings from behind a curtain to listen to debates she wasn't legally permitted to attend, and controlling access to her teenage son the same way Livia had once controlled access to a dying Augustus. It could not last, and both of them almost certainly knew it. Nero was not Tiberius, quiet, dutiful, willing to live in his mother's shadow for decades. He resented Agrippina's control from very early on, and their relationship curdled from partnership into open rivalry within just a couple of years. He began an affair with a woman named Ac that Agrippina disapproved of. He grew close to advisors who actively worked to diminish her influence, seeing correctly that an emperor ruled by his mother was an emperor other men couldn't fully influence themselves. Agrippina, watching her control slip, reportedly threatened to switch her support to Britannicus instead, a threat that, if the sources are accurate, may have directly triggered Britannicus's poisoning at that infamous banquet we covered in the last chapter. If Agrippina meant that threat as leverage over her son, it cost the one person she was threatening to promote his own life. The relationship between mother and son spiraled from there into something closer to warfare than family. By AD 59, Nero had decided his mother needed to die, and what followed is one of the strangest, darkest, most theatrical assassination stories in all of Roman history. His first plan, according to Tacitus and Suetonius, was almost absurdly elaborate: a collapsible boat, engineered specifically to fall apart at sea and drown Agrippina without any visible evidence of foul play. Disguised as a tragic accident during a pleasant celebratory voyage Nero himself arranged to lure her aboard. The boat did partially collapse as planned. Agrippina, according to the accounts, survived by swimming to shore, either because the mechanism malfunctioned or because she simply had the physical strength and presence of mind to escape the wreckage before it fully sank. She made it home, alive, and sent word to her son that she'd survived a terrible accident, apparently either genuinely unaware it had been an assassination attempt, or aware and playing along, buying herself time to figure out her next move. Nero panicked. If his mother suspected the truth, she had allies, resources, and years of political skill to potentially retaliate or expose him. He couldn't risk waiting. He sent soldiers directly to her villa that same night. Agrippina, confronted by an assassin sent by her own son, reportedly bared her stomach and told him to strike there, the wound that had carried the child now ordering her death. Whether that detail is verbatim fact or dramatic embellishment added by later historians for effect, the core outcome is not disputed by any ancient source. Agrippina the Younger, the most powerful woman in the history of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, was beaten and stabbed to death on her son's direct order. And then comes the detail that has haunted every retelling since. Multiple ancient sources claim Nero personally traveled to view his mother's body afterward, and reportedly examined it, commenting, depending on the source, either on her beauty or, in a darker version repeated by several ancient writers, making a crude remark about not having realized she had such an attractive figure. Historians debate how literally to take that specific claim, given how eager ancient writers were to paint Nero as monstrous in every possible way. But even the most cautious readings agree on the substance underneath the most shocking detail. The son ordered the murder, and then went to look at what he'd done. Agrippina the Younger spent her entire life engineering outcomes other people couldn't imagine, surviving exile, surviving her brother's paranoia, marrying her way back to the center of imperial power, poisoning an emperor to install her own son, and ruling an empire from behind a curtain for a brief, extraordinary window of time no Roman woman had occupied before her. And in the end, the single person she couldn't outmaneuver was the one person she'd built her entire life around protecting and elevating. That, more than the poison, more than the exile, more than the murders along the way, is what makes her story land so hard. Even 2,000 years later, she didn't lose to a rival. She lost to her own creation. Fulvia. She is the first woman in Roman history to have her own face minted onto a coin. She raised her own legions. She personally besieged a city. And Mark Antony, her husband, the second most powerful man in Rome, spent years being described by his enemies not as her partner, but as the man taking orders from his wife. Fulvia doesn't usually make it onto lists like this one, because her crime, in the eyes of Roman writers, wasn't murder or poison. It was something Roman men found almost as unforgivable, refusing to stay out of politics. She was married 3 times, and all 3 husbands were major political players in the last chaotic decades of the Roman Republic. Her first husband, Publius Clodius Pulcher, was a populist firebrand, a street-level political operator who used organized gangs to control Roman politics through intimidation as much as debate, and when he was murdered by a rival gang in 52 BC. Fulvia is described by ancient sources as having displayed his mutilated body publicly and whipped up the crowd into a riot so violent that they burned down the Senate house itself using the benches as fuel for his funeral pyre. She was, from her very first appearance in the historical record, someone who understood the theater of public anger and wasn't afraid to use it. Her second husband, Gaius Scribonius Curio, died in battle in Africa fighting for Julius Caesar's cause during the Civil War. Her third husband was Mark Antony, Caesar's closest ally, and after Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, one of the 3 men who divided the Roman world between them as the Second Triumvirate. It's during her marriage to Antony that Fulvia becomes something almost unprecedented in Roman history. A woman who didn't merely influence politics from behind the scenes, but who actively, publicly, directed military and political campaigns in her own name while her husband was away. When Octavian and Antony's triumvirate began carrying out proscriptions, organized executions of political enemies, with property confiscated and heads displayed in the forum for payment, ancient sources, including Cassius Dio, describe Fulvia taking an active, personal role in identifying targets, including men she had personal grievances against entirely separate from her husband's politics. One infamous story claims that when Cicero, the great orator who had spent years attacking both her second husband Curio's political circle and Antony directly in a series of devastating speeches, was killed and his severed head brought to Antony, Fulvia took it, spat on it, pulled out his tongue, and stabbed it repeatedly with a hairpin, a final, grotesque act of revenge against the voice that had humiliated her family in public for years. Historians treat the hairpin detail with some skepticism as likely embellishment, but the underlying hostility between Fulvia and Cicero was very real and well documented independently. But Fulvia's most extraordinary moment came in 41 BC, while Antony was in the eastern half of the empire dealing with Cleopatra and Parthian threats, leaving Fulvia and Antony's brother Lucius effectively representing his interests back in Italy. Octavian, meanwhile, was redistributing land to veteran soldiers in ways that Fulvia believed threatened her husband's political standing and his soldiers' loyalty back home. Rather than simply write letters of complaint, Fulvia did something no Roman woman had done before her. She raised troops. She is described by multiple ancient sources as actively organizing military resistance against Octavian's forces, appearing before soldiers wearing a sword and giving orders and commands as though she were a general herself, coordinating with Lucius Antonius to seize the city of Rome itself in Antony's name before Octavian's forces pushed them back and besieged them at the city of Perugia. The siege of Perugia, in the winter of 41 to 40 BC, ended in defeat for Fulvia's side. The city fell, and Octavian's forces punished it brutally, but the sheer fact that a Roman consul's wife had organized and directed a military campaign against the future Augustus himself was, and remains, almost without parallel in the historical record. And it's during this period that coins were minted bearing Fulvia's image, the very first time in Roman history a living, non-mythological woman's face had appeared on Roman currency. Some of these coins, minted in the eastern provinces where Antony's allies held sway, depicted her wearing the winged helmet associated with Nike, goddess of victory, an image of a woman literally cast in the visual language of martial triumph. Octavian's propaganda machine responded exactly the way you'd expect a deeply patriarchal political culture to respond, by making Fulvia the villain of the entire episode, rather than his own increasingly aggressive land seizures. Roman writers sympathetic to Octavian painted her as a shrewish, power-hungry wife who had dragged the naturally reasonable Lucius Antonius into an unnecessary war, and who had effectively been running her absent husband's affairs like a general in her own right, because Antony himself was too distracted by Cleopatra to notice or care. It's a narrative that conveniently let Octavian avoid blame for the underlying land disputes that actually triggered the conflict, while turning a genuinely unprecedented moment of female political and military agency into a cautionary tale about a wife who forgot her place. When the siege of Perugia collapsed, Fulvia fled to Greece to meet Antony, who was finally returning west. Their reunion, according to the sources, was cold. Antony was reportedly furious about the disaster at Perugia and the political embarrassment it had caused him, and whatever partnership had existed between them earlier in the marriage had clearly fractured under the weight of military defeat and mutual blame. Fulvia fell ill not long afterward, in the city of Sicyon in Greece, and died in 40 BC before she and Antony ever fully reconciled. Her death, oddly, ended up serving Antony's political interests better than her life had in that final chapter. With Fulvia gone, Antony and Octavian negotiated a peace treaty at Brundisium, sealed by Antony's marriage to Octavian's own sister, Octavia, a marriage explicitly framed by both sides as proof that the civil hostilities stirred up by Fulvia was now resolved. A convenient narrative that let both triumvirs pretend the underlying political and territorial conflicts had been a matter of one difficult woman's meddling rather than a genuine structural rivalry between two power-hungry men. That's the injustice sitting at the center of Fulvia's story, and it's worth naming directly. She's remembered by many ancient sources, and plenty of modern retellings that lean on them uncritically, as a nagging, power-mad wife who couldn't stay in her lane. But strip away the moralizing language, and what you actually find is a woman who organized political resistance, commanded troops, minted her own currency, and directly challenged the future first emperor of Rome militarily at a moment when her husband wasn't even in the country to do it himself. No other Roman woman before her had done anything close to that. Few would again. Was Fulvia one of the worst women in Roman history? By the standards of the men writing about her at the time, men who found an ambitious, militarily active woman more threatening than an ambitious, militarily active man, absolutely. She broke a rule so fundamental that Roman writers didn't even always bother spelling it out. Women were supposed to influence power quietly, from inside the home, never with a sword in hand and soldiers at their back. Fulvia ignored that rule completely, for one extraordinary winter in 41 BC, and Rome never fully forgave her for it. Fausta. She accused her own stepson of a crime that got him executed. Months later, her father-in-law had her boiled alive in her own bathhouse. And to this day, historians still can't agree on whether her accusation was even true. Her name was Flavia Maxima Fausta, and her story sits at the exact hinge point where the old pagan Roman Empire was giving way to something new, because her husband was Constantine the Great, the emperor who would legalize Christianity and reshape the entire trajectory of Western civilization. And in the middle of that world historical transformation sits a family tragedy so dark and so poorly documented that ancient historians themselves seemed almost too uncomfortable to write it down clearly. Fausta was born around AD 289 or 290, the daughter of Maximian, one of the senior emperors during the period of the Tetrarchy, when Rome was governed by multiple co-emperors ruling different regions simultaneously in an attempt to make the empire more manageable. She was betrothed to Constantine as a young girl, part of a political alliance between her father and Constantine's father, Constantius, a marriage designed purely to cement power-sharing arrangements between two ambitious military dynasties, the way most elite Roman marriages were designed. The actual wedding didn't take place until 307, by which point Fausta was likely around 17 or 18, and Constantine was already a rising military commander with his eyes on supreme power. The marriage came with real political value attached. Maximian's support helped bolster Constantine's legitimacy at a moment when the Tetrarchy's carefully balanced power-sharing system was collapsing into open civil war between rival claimants to the throne. And almost immediately, the marriage was tested by exactly the kind of betrayal Roman political families specialized in. Fausta's own father, Maximian, turned against Constantine only a few years into the marriage, attempting to seize power for himself while Constantine was away campaigning. According to the historian Zosimus and other ancient sources, when Maximian tried to convince Fausta to help him overthrow her own husband, asking her to leave the palace gates unlocked so his soldiers could get in and kill Constantine in his sleep, Fausta instead went straight to her husband and warned him. Constantine set a trap, ambushed his father-in-law's assassination attempt, and Maximian was ultimately forced into suicide not long afterward. That episode is genuinely remarkable, and it's important context for everything that follows, because it establishes something crucial about Fausta. She had already proven, once, that she would choose her husband over her own blood family when the two came into direct conflict. Whatever happened between her and her stepson years later, it didn't happen because Fausta was simply disloyal or reckless by nature. If anything, the early record shows the opposite. For years afterward, the marriage between Constantine and Fausta appeared successful by the standards of Roman imperial politics. She bore him at least 3 sons who would eventually become co-emperors themselves, along with several daughters, and she held the title of Augusta, Empress, with real public visibility and honor attached to her name. Cities were named after her. Coins were minted bearing her image, celebrating her fertility and her role as mother to the next generation of the dynasty. But Constantine had another son, older than any of Fausta's children, from an earlier relationship with a woman named Minervina before his marriage to Fausta. That son's name was Crispus, and by the early 320s he had grown into an accomplished, popular young military commander in his own right, winning a major naval victory that helped secure his father's control over the eastern Mediterranean during Constantine's final war against his last rival co-emperor, Licinius. Crispus was, by every surviving account, talented, well-liked by the army, and being groomed as one of Constantine's principal heirs. And then, in AD 326, everything collapsed with almost no warning and remarkably little explanation left behind in the surviving historical record. Constantine ordered Crispus arrested and executed. The exact charges were never clearly recorded in any surviving contemporary source, which is itself deeply strange given how meticulously Constantine's reign was otherwise documented by Christian historians eager to celebrate him. Crispus was put to death, reportedly by poison, at a villa in northern Italy, while still a young man in what should have been the prime of a promising career. Only weeks later, and this is where Fausta enters the story directly, Constantine ordered his own wife executed as well. According to several later sources, including the historian Zosimus and the church historian Sozomen, the two deaths were connected. The accusation that led to Crispus's execution allegedly came from Fausta herself, who reportedly claimed that her stepson had made improper sexual advances toward her, or possibly that she'd falsely accused him of adultery or an affair to eliminate a rival to her own son's claims on the succession. When Constantine later discovered, supposedly through his own mother, Helena, who was deeply attached to her grandson Crispus and horrified by his death, that Fausta's accusation may have been fabricated, he had his wife killed as well, reportedly by having her shut inside an overheated bathhouse until she suffocated or was effectively boiled alive. It's important to be honest about how shaky this narrative actually is. Ancient sources on this episode are late, fragmentary, and often openly hostile to Constantine for their own religious or political reasons, particularly the pagan historian Zosimus, who had every incentive to paint the first Christian emperor in the worst possible light. Some modern historians believe the entire false accusation of seduction narrative may itself be a later invention or exaggeration, layered onto a political purge whose real cause was likely more straightforward. Fausta may have seen Crispus as a genuine threat to her own son's path to the throne and worked to eliminate him through whatever means were available, true or fabricated. And Constantine may have later turned on her for entirely separate reasons, political, personal, or both, that had little to do with any late revelation of innocence. What almost every source does agree on, regardless of the exact mechanics, is the basic outline. Crispus died on his father's orders in AD 326. Fausta died on her husband's orders only weeks or months later that same year, and the two deaths were connected in the public memory of the era closely enough that ancient writers consistently link them together as a single family catastrophe, whatever the precise chain of causation actually was. And then something almost as strange happened to the historical record itself. Near total, deliberate silence. Constantine's own court historians, men who wrote extensively and admiringly about nearly every other aspect of his reign, barely mention Crispus and Fausta's deaths at all. The Christian historian Eusebius, who wrote a detailed biography of Constantine specifically designed to celebrate his legacy, simply omits the entire episode, as though it never happened. It's a silence loud enough to be its own kind of historical evidence, a family tragedy so damaging to Constantine's carefully constructed image as a wise, pious, divinely favored ruler that his own propagandists apparently decided the safest response was to pretend it never occurred at all. So where does that leave Fausta's legacy? Unlike Messalina or Agrippina, we don't have detailed, contemporary accounts of specific plots or motives from her own lifetime. We have a gap in the record, filled in decades and centuries later by writers with their own agendas, describing a stepmother whose accusation, true or false, ended a young man's life, and whose own death just weeks later suggests that whatever she'd done, it cost Constantine something he wasn't willing to simply absorb and move past. If the traditional account is accurate, Fausta belongs on this list for one of the darkest reasons imaginable. Sacrificing an innocent stepson's life to protect her own children's inheritance, using the oldest weapon available to a Roman woman with no army and no independent political base of her own, an accusation whispered into the ear of the one man with the power to act on it instantly and without appeal. And if the account isn't accurate, if Fausta was in fact telling the truth, or acting on a genuine grievance, or simply became collateral damage in a purge Constantine had decided on for entirely separate political reasons, then her real crime wasn't cruelty at all. It was simply being married to a man powerful enough that when he decided she was no longer useful to him, there was no court in the Roman world that could save her, and no historian brave enough, for centuries afterward, to even write down clearly what had actually happened to her. Either way, the lesson embedded in Fausta's story is the same one that runs underneath almost every name on this list. In Rome, being the emperor's wife wasn't safety. It was proximity to the only kind of danger that could kill you instantly, on a single accusation, with no trial and no appeal, whether you were the one making the accusation or the one it eventually turned around and consumed. Poppaea Sabina. Ancient historians claim Nero killed her by kicking her, pregnant, in a fit of rage over something as small as coming home late from the races. Whether that specific detail is true or not, one thing isn't in dispute. The woman who spent a decade reshaping the most notorious emperor in Roman history died at his hands, in his own palace, carrying his child. Poppaea Sabina wasn't born into the imperial family. She was born into old Roman money and, by every ancient account, extraordinary beauty. Tacitus, who rarely wastes a compliment on anyone, describes her as possessing every physical grace except a virtuous character, which tells you exactly how Roman historians wanted her remembered before her story had even properly started. She married twice before Nero ever noticed her. Her first husband was a Roman knight. Her second was Otho, a close friend of Nero's and a fellow member of his inner circle of companions, a man who would himself briefly become emperor years later in the chaos of AD 69. It's through Otho that Poppaea's path crossed Nero's, and ancient sources disagree about exactly how deliberate that crossing was. Suetonius suggests Otho may have introduced her to Nero as a kind of favor or flattery, and then found himself pushed out of his own marriage once the emperor took an interest. Tacitus paints a more calculating picture, suggesting Poppaea herself orchestrated the connection, using Otho's friendship with Nero as a stepping stone toward the one man in Rome who could actually give her what she wanted. Whatever the mechanics, the outcome was the same. Nero fell for her hard, and Otho was sent away from Rome entirely, dispatched to govern the distant province of Lusitania, conveniently far from the wife he'd just lost. Here's where Poppaea becomes more than just another beautiful face passing through an emperor's bed. Unlike some of Nero's earlier relationships, which came and went with his moods, Poppaea appears to have understood exactly how to make herself indispensable, and exactly how to use her position once she had it. There was, however, one enormous obstacle standing between her and the title of Empress. Nero was already married to Claudius's daughter Octavia, and Nero's mother Agrippina, despite her increasingly rocky relationship with her son, still had enough influence in AD 58 to make divorcing Octavia politically messy. We already know what happened to Agrippina. In the last chapter on her, we covered the collapsing boat, the botched escape, and the soldiers sent to finish the job in AD 59. What we didn't cover is the theory, floated by several ancient historians, that Poppaea was one of the voices pushing Nero toward that final, fatal decision, framing Agrippina as an obstacle not just to Nero's independence, but specifically to his marrying her. Tacitus doesn't claim this outright, but he places the timelines suggestively close together, and later historians have run with the implication ever since. True or not, Agrippina's death cleared the single biggest political roadblock standing between Poppaea and the throne. Octavia was next. Nero divorced her in AD 62 on grounds of infertility, a charge that rings hollow given how young and otherwise healthy Octavia was, and married Poppaea almost immediately after. But divorce wasn't enough to make Poppaea feel secure. Octavia was still popular with the Roman public, who saw her as the wronged, legitimate wife of Claudius's bloodline, and popularity in Rome had a way of turning into political danger. Ancient sources describe Poppaea pushing for more, and within months Octavia was accused of adultery, exiled to the island of Pandateria, and executed there on Nero's orders. Her head, according to several accounts, was brought back to Rome and presented to Poppaea, a grim trophy confirming that the rival was truly gone. If that story is accurate, and historians remain divided on how literally to take it, it places Poppaea in genuinely dark company. But it's worth pausing on how consistent this specific pattern is across nearly every woman on this list. Removing a rival wife wasn't unique to Poppaea. It was practically the standard operating procedure of imperial Rome, a system where the difference between being empress and being executed frequently came down to whoever struck first. Once secured as Nero's wife, Poppaea's influence over him appears to have been substantial, and in at least one respect, genuinely surprising given Nero's later reputation as history's great persecutor of Christians. Josephus, the Jewish Roman historian, describes Poppaea as sympathetic to Jewish causes and records that she personally intervened with Nero on behalf of a Jewish delegation, using her access to the emperor to influence policy in the empire's eastern provinces. It's a detail that complicates the flat, villain reading of her character, suggesting a woman who used her position for more than simply eliminating rivals, someone who understood that real power meant shaping actual policy, not just palace intrigue. But it's her death, more than any single act of her life, that has defined Poppaea's place in history. In AD 65, pregnant with Nero's child, she died suddenly. Tacitus's account is brutal and specific. He claims Nero, in a fit of anger, kicked her in the stomach after she complained about him returning late from the chariot races, and that the injury killed her. Suetonius repeats a similar account. Whether the story is literal fact or a piece of the broader hostile tradition that grew up around Nero after his death, designed to paint him as the ultimate monster capable of killing even the wife he'd fought so hard to marry, is genuinely difficult to determine from this historical distance. What we do know is stranger and, in its own way, sadder than the murder story itself. Nero didn't simply bury Poppaea and move on the way emperors typically handled the deaths of inconvenient wives. He gave her a lavish, unprecedented funeral, had her body embalmed in the Egyptian style rather than cremated in the traditional Roman manner, and deified her, granting her official status as a goddess, an honor previously extended to figures like the deified Claudius, but almost never to a woman who wasn't part of the founding imperial bloodline. Cassius Dio adds one final, deeply strange detail. Unable to fully let go, Nero later found a freedman who physically resembled Poppaea, had him castrated, and kept him at court in her place, even, according to some accounts, going through a form of marriage ceremony with him. Whatever actually happened in that room in AD 65, the aftermath tells you that Poppaea wasn't simply a beautiful woman Nero discarded once he was finished with her. She was someone he'd genuinely reorganized his entire life around, twice divorcing and once effectively murdering to keep, and whose death seems to have left him grasping for ways to bring some version of her back rather than simply replacing her. So where does Poppaea fit on a list of Rome's worst women? By the ancient source's own account, she orchestrated the downfall of at least two rivals, Agrippina and Octavia, clearing every obstacle between herself and the throne with the same ruthless efficiency the other women on this list relied on. But she's also the rare figure here whose death reads less like justice catching up with a schemer, and more like an act of raw, personal violence from a husband who had already proven, repeatedly, exactly how far he was willing to go against anyone who stood in his way, including his own mother. Poppaea climbed to the very top of Nero's world by learning to use the same tools everyone around her used. In the end, she died by the very temper she'd helped unleash on everyone else standing between her and the throne. Julia Maesa. She took a 14-year-old boy who spent his days dancing in women's makeup as a Syrian sun priest, convinced the Roman army he was secretly the illegitimate son of a dead emperor, and put him on the throne of Rome. When that plan collapsed into disaster, she quietly arranged to have him murdered too, and installed her other grandson in his place. Julia Maesa doesn't get the same attention as Livia or Agrippina, largely because she operated a full generation after Rome's more famous dynastic crises, deep into the 3rd century AD, when the empire itself was becoming increasingly unstable and increasingly willing to accept whoever the army decided to back. But in terms of sheer, cold-blooded political engineering, Maesa may have outmaneuvered every woman who came before her, because she didn't just influence one emperor's succession. She built two of them herself, from nothing, using an army as her instrument. She was born in the Syrian city of Maesa, into a family that held the hereditary priesthood of the local sun god, Elagabalus, a position that came with serious regional wealth and influence even before her family's fortunes became tied to the imperial throne itself. Her sister, Julia Domna, married the future Emperor Septimius Severus, and when Severus took power in AD 193 after a brutal civil war, the Syrian branch of the family suddenly found itself at the absolute center of Roman politics, an extraordinary rise for a family from a provincial priesthood most senators back in Rome had probably never heard of before. Maesa spent the following decades embedded at the heart of imperial power, watching her sister navigate the court of Severus, and then the increasingly volatile reign of her nephew Caracalla, one of Severus's sons, who ruled after his father's death. When Caracalla was assassinated in AD 217 in a plot led by his own Praetorian prefect, Macrinus, the family's position collapsed overnight. Macrinus seized the throne for himself, and Maesa, along with her sister Julia Domna, found herself abruptly stripped of influence, no longer family to the reigning emperor, but simply relatives of the man he'd replaced. Julia Domna died shortly afterward, reportedly by suicide or from an illness worsened by the sudden loss of status, and Macrinus ordered Maesa to leave Rome and return to Maesa, likely assuming that removing her from the capital would remove her from politics entirely. He was catastrophically wrong. Back in Maesa, Maesa still controlled enormous personal wealth, and she still had 2 grandsons through her daughters, both being raised in the family's hereditary priesthood of the sun god. The elder, a 14-year-old boy usually known to history as Elagabalus, after the god he served, was strikingly charismatic even as a young teenager, and Maesa began quietly spreading a rumor among the soldiers of the nearby legion that he was actually the secret illegitimate son of Caracalla, the murdered emperor of the army had genuinely loved, rather than merely his cousin. It was almost certainly untrue. Modern historians treat the claim as a calculated fabrication, designed specifically to exploit soldiers' lingering loyalty to Caracalla and their resentment of Macrinus, who was deeply unpopular with the legions for cutting military pay and privileges. But true or not, it worked. Maesa reportedly used her family's fortune to bribe the local legion directly, and in AD 218, that legion declared her teenage grandson emperor, kicking off a brief civil war between his forces and Macrinus's. Macrinus's army, poorly led and increasingly demoralized, was defeated within months. Macrinus himself was captured and executed while trying to flee. Maesa's fabricated claim and her money had done what armies of legitimate heirs had failed to do throughout Roman history: put an unknown teenager from a provincial priesthood directly onto the imperial throne. What followed was one of the strangest and most chaotic reigns in Roman history, and it's a reign Maesa spent constantly trying, and largely failing, to control. Elagabalus, now emperor, brought his religious practices from Maesa directly into Roman public life in ways the deeply conservative Roman aristocracy found scandalous and, at times, genuinely alarming. He installed his sun god as the supreme deity of the Roman pantheon, outranking even Jupiter, forced senators to attend elaborate religious ceremonies celebrating a god most of them had never heard of before his reign began, and, according to numerous ancient sources, engaged in behavior around gender and sexuality that scandalized Rome's traditional elite, reportedly offering enormous sums to any physician who could perform gender reassignment surgery, a detail modern historians treat with real interest given what it might suggest about the emperor's own gender identity, filtered as it inevitably is through hostile ancient sources determined to use it as evidence of depravity. Maesa watched her carefully engineered emperor become wildly, dangerously unpopular, both with the Senate and, more critically, with the same Praetorian Guard whose loyalty had put him on the throne in the first place. She understood, correctly, that an unpopular emperor was a short-lived one, and that when Elagabalus fell, her entire family's position could collapse with him. So she did something almost unimaginably cold. She began preparing his replacement, using her other grandson, a calmer, more conventional 13-year-old boy named Alexianus. She convinced Elagabalus himself, reportedly through a combination of pressure and manipulation, to formally adopt his cousin as his own heir and grant him the title of Caesar in AD 221, presenting it publicly as a gesture of family unity while privately building the exact alternative the Guard would need once they turned on Elagabalus for good. They turned within the year. In March of AD 222, the Praetorian Guard, fed up with Elagabalus's increasingly erratic and scandalous behavior, and possibly encouraged by Maesa's own quiet maneuvering behind the scenes, murdered him along with his mother, and proclaimed his cousin emperor in his place under the name Severus Alexander. It's a genuinely difficult moment to fully untangle from the historical record. Ancient sources don't explicitly claim Maesa ordered her own grandson's assassination, but the timeline is damning on its own terms. She had spent the previous year deliberately building his replacement, elevating a rival heir specifically to be ready the moment Elagabalus's support collapsed, and when that collapse arrived exactly on schedule, her backup plan was waiting, fully installed, with no gap in the succession at all. Severus Alexander became emperor at 13, and for the next several years, Maesa effectively ran the empire through him and his mother, Julia Mamaea, forming a genuine ruling triumvirate of women controlling imperial policy from behind an adolescent figurehead, a level of open, sustained female political authority that Rome had never quite seen in this particular configuration before. Maesa died a few years into Alexander's reign, likely around AD 224 or 225, having accomplished something no woman before her had managed, engineering the rise of not one but two Roman emperors, entirely from outside the traditional lines of imperial succession, using nothing but family wealth, a fabricated paternity claim, and an unflinching willingness to discard her own creation the moment he became a liability. That's the detail worth sitting with longer than any of the scandal around Elagabalus's reign itself. Maesa didn't get attached to her own plans. She built an emperor, watched him become dangerous to the family's survival, and quietly built his replacement well before the first one had even fallen. In a political culture that destroyed nearly every woman on this list the moment their usefulness to power ran out, Julia Maesa is one of the very few who managed to stay one calculated step ahead of that ending, right up until she died peacefully, having outlasted every plan she'd ever set in motion. Justa Grata Honoria. She sent her ring to the most feared man in the ancient world and asked him to rescue her from an arranged marriage. He took that ring as a marriage proposal, and half of her dowry claim as an invitation to invade the Western Roman Empire. His name was Attila the Hun. Justa Grata Honoria was born around AD 417 or 418, the daughter of the Western Emperor Constantius III and Galla Placidia, a formidable political operator in her own right whose story closes out this list in the next chapter. Honoria was the older sister of Valentinian III, who became Western Emperor as a child, which meant Honoria spent her entire life in an unusually exposed position. Sister to the reigning emperor, carrying real dynastic value, but with no formal path to power of her own beyond whatever marriage the court arranged for her. And every reason for that same court to view her as a potential threat if she ever married someone with imperial ambitions of his own. The court's solution was to keep her essentially sidelined, granted the title of Augusta, honored publicly, but watched closely and kept away from any marriage that might produce a rival claimant to her brother's throne. Ancient sources suggest this created exactly the kind of resentment you'd expect from a woman with real royal blood and effectively no autonomy over her own future. Around AD 449 or 450, that resentment exploded into scandal. Ancient sources, principally the historian Priscus and later chroniclers drawing on his now largely lost original account, describe Honoria becoming involved in an affair with a court official named Eugenius, and when the affair was discovered, being swiftly married off, seemingly as punishment, to a loyal senator named Herculanus, a man chosen specifically because he had no political ambition and therefore posed no dynastic threat. Honoria, by every surviving account, was furious, trapped in a marriage designed explicitly to neutralize her, with no path back to the freedom or influence she'd once had. She made a decision so audacious that it still reads as almost unbelievable 14 centuries later. She sent a messenger, along with her personal ring, to Attila the Hun. At this point in the 5th century, Attila was the single most feared military power in Europe, having built the Hunnic Empire into a force that both the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire paid tribute to simply to keep at bay. Honoria's message, according to Priscus's account, asked Attila to help free her from the marriage the court had forced on her. What she may have intended as a plea for rescue or protection, Attila interpreted, or chose to interpret, as something else entirely, a marriage proposal, complete with a dowry claim to half of the Western Roman Empire, since Honoria was, after all, a genuine daughter of the imperial house. Whether Honoria actually meant to propose marriage, or was simply reaching for the most powerful ally imaginable to escape a marriage she despised, is a question historians still debate, and one the ancient sources themselves don't fully resolve. But the practical outcome was catastrophic regardless of her original intent. Attila sent envoys to the Western court formally demanding Honoria be handed over as his bride, along with her claimed share of imperial territory. When the court, predictably, refused and insisted the entire episode was a misunderstanding, Attila had exactly the pretext he needed. He invaded Gaul in AD 451, and though he was checked at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains by a combined Roman and Visigothic force in one of the largest battles of late antiquity, He returned the following year and invaded Italy itself in AD 452, devastating northern Italian cities before eventually withdrawing, reportedly after negotiations led by Pope Leo I, though disease and supply shortages within Attila's own army likely played just as large a role in that withdrawal as any papal diplomacy. It's genuinely difficult to overstate how strange this episode is within the broader arc of Roman history. A single sister's personal message, born out of what appears to have been genuine desperation to escape an unwanted marriage, became the stated justification for one of the most significant barbarian invasions of the collapsing Western Roman Empire, at the exact historical moment that empire could least afford it. As for Honoria herself, her fate afterward is almost frustratingly undocumented. She simply disappears from the historical record after the crisis her message triggered. Some later, less reliable sources suggest she was executed by her own family for the scandal and its catastrophic consequences. Others suggest she was quietly kept under closer confinement for the remainder of her life. We genuinely don't know, which is its own kind of statement about how little Roman history cared to record what happened to women once they'd stopped being politically useful, or, in Honoria's case, once they'd become spectacularly, disastrously inconvenient. Was Honoria one of Rome's worst women, in the sense that word usually carries on this list, murderous or ruthlessly ambitious? Not really, at least not by any account that survives. Her crime, if you want to call it that, was reaching for freedom through the only lever of power available to a royal woman with no formal political authority of her own, an appeal to a foreign king, sent almost certainly without any real understanding of how catastrophically that appeal would be received, or how far a desperate teenage plea could travel once it landed in the hands of a man already looking for an excuse to invade. Her story earns its place on this list less as a tale of calculated cruelty, and more as a warning about what happens when a political system gives a woman with real royal blood absolutely no legitimate outlet for her own ambitions or desires. Denied any real path forward, Honoria reached for the most powerful hand extended toward her, without fully grasping, or perhaps without caring, just how much of the Western Roman world would burn as a result. Julia the Younger, her own grandfather, the first emperor of Rome, exiled her to a barren island and left explicit instructions in his will that when she eventually died, her body should not be brought back to the family tomb. Not even in death would he forgive her. Julia the Younger was born around 19 BC, the granddaughter of Augustus through his only daughter, Julia the Elder, and by the time she reached adulthood, she occupied one of the most dangerous positions available to any woman in the Roman world, a direct descendant of the emperor himself, with real dynastic value attached to her bloodline, married off young to a prominent senator named Lucius Aemilius Paulus, in a match designed to bind another powerful Roman family more tightly into the imperial fold. For years, Julia the Younger appears in the historical record only faintly, the way most Roman women do when they aren't currently at the center of a scandal. That changed dramatically in AD 8, when Augustus, in the very same year, he exiled the poet Ovid for reasons ancient sources describe only vaguely as connected to a poem and an error, also banished his own granddaughter to the remote island of Trimaris, off the coast of Italy, and had her husband Paulus executed on charges of conspiracy. The ancient sources are frustratingly thin on exactly what Julia the Younger actually did to earn this punishment. Tacitus mentions her exile only briefly, in passing, decades later, without ever fully explaining the underlying charge. The most commonly repeated explanation, drawn from later and less reliable sources, is adultery, an accusation almost identical to the one that had already exiled her own mother, Julia the Elder, years earlier under nearly identical circumstances. A coincidence striking enough that some modern historians suspect the family's women were being punished for something closer to political conspiracy than personal scandal, with adultery serving as the publicly acceptable cover story for crimes. Augustus preferred not to spell out too explicitly in public. That suspicion gains real weight from the fact that her husband, Paulus, was executed specifically on a conspiracy charge, not an adultery charge, the same year Julia was exiled. If Paulus was genuinely plotting against Augustus, whether independently or in coordination with his wife, It would explain both the severity of Julia's punishment and Augustus's unusual refusal to ever soften his position toward her in the years that followed, the way he'd occasionally, grudgingly softened toward other exiled family members over time. And he truly never softened. Augustus's treatment of his granddaughter stands out even within a family whose history was saturated with exile and execution, because of just how permanent and pointed his anger toward her remained until the moment of his own death. In his will, drawn up years after her banishment, Augustus explicitly excluded Julia the Younger from being buried in the imperial mausoleum alongside the rest of the family, a level of specific, deliberate posthumous punishment that historians have found genuinely startling given how rarely Roman wills bothered spelling out exclusions in such pointed detail. Julia the Younger remained in exile for the rest of her life, reportedly dying around AD 28, a full 20 years after her original banishment, having spent essentially her entire adult life on that island, never recalled, never forgiven, outliving Augustus himself by well over a decade with no change in her circumstances even after his death, since Tiberius, his successor, apparently saw no political benefit in reversing a punishment his predecessor had cared so deeply about enforcing. There's a detail buried in the ancient sources that makes her story even darker and even more tangled with the other women on this list. Julia the Younger reportedly gave birth to a child after her exile began, a child ancient sources suggest may not have been her husband's, and Augustus, in a chilling and rarely discussed episode, is said to have ordered the infant exposed, left to die, rather than allow the child to be raised, a punishment that fell not on Julia herself but on an infant who'd played no part in whatever crime its mother had actually committed. So why include Julia the Younger on a list of Rome's worst women, when the historical record barely tells us what she actually did? Because her story, more than almost any other on this list, exposes the machinery underneath all the others. We don't actually know if Julia the Younger was guilty of adultery, conspiracy, both, or something else entirely that the surviving sources simply chose not to preserve. What we know for certain is that a Roman emperor was willing to banish his own granddaughter to a barren island for 20 years, order her infant child left to die, and specifically exclude her body from the family tomb in his own will, based on an accusation history can no longer even clearly reconstruct. If you want to understand how quickly and totally Roman power could turn on the women closest to it, often on evidence we can no longer even evaluate, Julia the Younger's near silence in the historical record tells you more than a detailed scandal ever could. She isn't remembered for a specific, vivid crime the way Messalina or Agrippina are. She's remembered, if she's remembered at all, for having been erased so completely and so deliberately that even 2,000 years of historians still can't say with confidence what she actually did to deserve it. Galla Placidia. She was kidnapped by an invading army, married the enemy king who took her captive, watched him die within a year, was traded back to Rome like political cargo, and then spent the next 2.5 decades ruling the crumbling Western Roman Empire through her own son. If any single woman's life traces the entire collapse of Roman power in the West, it's hers. Galla Placidia was born around AD 388 or 389, the daughter of the Emperor Theodosius I, and by the time she reached her early 20s, the Western Roman Empire she'd been born into was already coming apart at the seams. In AD 410, the Visigothic king Alaric sacked the city of Rome itself, the first time in 800 years a foreign army had breached the city's walls, an event so psychologically devastating to the Roman world that St. Augustine wrote an entire work, The City of God, partly in response to the shock of it. Galla Placidia was living in Rome when it happened, and when Alaric's forces withdrew, they took her with them as a hostage, a piece of extraordinarily valuable political leverage against the Roman state. What followed reads less like a captivity and more like a genuinely strange political marriage. Alaric died not long after the sack of Rome, and his successor, Athalf, kept Galla Placidia in his custody as the Visigoths moved through Gaul and eventually into Spain. In AD 414, Athalf married her, in a ceremony ancient sources describe as a full, formal Roman-style wedding, complete with Roman wedding customs and Roman guests present among his own Gothic nobility, an event some historians read as a genuine attempt by Athalf to signal a new relationship between the Goths and Rome. blending the two peoples rather than simply conquering them. Whether Galla Placidia's marriage was coerced, willingly accepted as the best available option for a captive with no other leverage, or something closer to a genuine political and personal partnership, is a question ancient sources leave frustratingly unresolved, and modern historians remain divided on it. What's clear is that she bore Athalf a son, whom they named Theodosius after her own father, a child who briefly represented an extraordinary possibility, a genuine merger of Roman and Gothic royal bloodlines. The child died in infancy. Athalf himself was assassinated shortly afterward, in AD 415, murdered by a rival within his own court, and Galla Placidia's position collapsed instantly from queen to hostage once again, treated brutally by Athalf's successor before eventually being ransomed back to the Roman court in exchange for a substantial shipment of grain, a transaction that reduced an emperor's daughter to the value of a trade good in the desperate, food-scarce politics of the collapsing West. Back in Roman territory, her half-brother, the Emperor Honorius, arranged her marriage to his general, Constantius, in AD 417, a marriage that was, once again, almost entirely political, cementing Constantius's position as the empire's most powerful military figure. Constantius was elevated to co-emperor in AD 421, making Galla Placidia empress for the second time in her life, this time within the Roman world itself rather than among the Goths who'd once held her captive. But Constantius died just months into his co-reign, and Galla Placidia, twice widowed by this point, found her position at court growing openly hostile, with Honorius's own advisors working to push her out entirely. She eventually fled to Constantinople with her two young children, seeking protection from the Eastern imperial court. Honorius died in AD 423 without an heir of his own, and the Western throne was briefly seized by a court official named Johannes in the resulting power vacuum. The Eastern court, however, backed Galla Placidia's young son, Valentinian, as the legitimate heir, and sent a military expedition west to install him on the throne, with Galla Placidia returning alongside the army as regent for her 6-year-old son. For the next 12 years, until Valentinian formally came of age, and in practice for long afterward, Galla Placidia effectively ruled the Western Roman Empire in his name, navigating one of the most difficult political landscapes any Roman ruler had ever faced. The West she governed was hemorrhaging territory, with Vandal armies seizing North Africa, one of Rome's most vital grain-producing provinces, and various Germanic kingdoms carving out increasingly permanent, semi-independent territories within what had once been unified Roman land. She had to balance the ambitions of powerful, often openly rivalrous generals, most notably the brilliant but dangerously ambitious commander Aetius, who would go on to lead the Roman and allied forces that finally checked Attila the Hun at the Catalonian plains, the very battle triggered, as we covered 2 chapters ago, by her own niece Honoria's desperate message. Galla Placidia's style of rule, compared to the murderous scheming of Livia or Agrippina, reads almost restrained by comparison, more focused on holding together a genuinely collapsing political structure than on eliminating rivals for personal advancement. That's precisely why her inclusion on a list of Rome's worst women is worth interrogating rather than simply accepting. Her real controversies were less about personal cruelty and more about the brutal, zero-sum political calculations required to keep the Western Empire functioning at all during a period when it was losing provinces faster than any government could realistically respond to. She died in AD 450. Just 1 year before the crisis her niece's message had exploded into Attila's invasion of Gaul, and only 26 years before the Western Roman Empire itself would formally end, when the last Western emperor was deposed in AD 476. In that sense, Galla Placidia's death almost perfectly bookends the empire she'd spent her adult life fighting to hold together. She didn't live to see it fully collapse, but she spent decades postponing that collapse through sheer, relentless political maneuvering, in a world that had already, by any honest measure, stopped being savable. Whether Galla Placidia belongs among Rome's worst women or its most underappreciated survivors depends almost entirely on which lens you choose to view her through. She was kidnapped, married into a foreign royal house, widowed twice, exiled once, and traded like cargo, and she still ended up ruling an empire for over a decade through raw political skill rather than inherited right. If nothing else, her story is proof that even in a system built to discard women the moment they stopped being useful, some of them simply refused to be discarded. 11 women, 5 centuries, and underneath every single one of their stories, the exact same machine grinding away. Look back across everyone we've covered. Livia, controlling a dying man's sickroom to make sure her son's succession went unchallenged. Messalina, marrying a second husband in public while her first was still emperor. Agrippina the Younger, poisoning her way to power only to be murdered by the very son she'd installed. Fulvia, raising an army because her husband wasn't in Rome to raise one himself. Fausta, whose single accusation ended a young man's life and cost her her own. Poppaea, clearing 2 rivals from her path only to die by the temper of the man she'd fought so hard to marry. Maesa, discarding her own grandson the moment he became a liability to the family's survival. Honoria, reaching for a foreign king's help and igniting an invasion she likely never intended. Julia the Younger, erased so completely from the record that we still don't fully know what she did to deserve 2 decades on a barren island. Galla Placidia, traded between 2 empires like cargo, and still ending up ruling one of them for over a decade. Here's the pattern, and it's worth stating plainly instead of leaving it buried in the individual stories. Roman women who wanted real power had exactly one formally sanctioned path to it, through a husband, a son, or a brother, never in their own name, never on their own authority. Every single woman on this list operated inside that constraint. The ones who accepted it quietly left almost no trace in the historical record at all. The ones we still talk about, 2,000 years later, are the ones who found some way around it. Poison in a dish of mushrooms. A fabricated claim of royal paternity. A public marriage announced without a first husband's knowledge. A ring sent to the most feared king in Europe. And then look at who wrote these stories down. Almost every source we've relied on across this entire list, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, was a Roman man, writing decades or even centuries after the events he described, working inside a deeply patriarchal political culture that had every incentive to frame ambitious women as monstrous, promiscuous, or unnatural, rather than simply competent political operators working within an impossibly narrow set of options. That doesn't mean these women were innocent. Several of them almost certainly ordered real murders. But it does mean we're viewing all of them through a lens specifically designed by the exact culture that limited their options in the first place, to make their ambition look like villainy rather than simply what it was, people responding rationally to a system that offered them no legitimate alternative. That's the real insight sitting underneath everything we've covered. History didn't just record what these women did. History decided, largely through the pens of men who had every reason to be threatened by them, how we'd be allowed to feel about it. Livia built an empire beside her husband and is remembered as a poisoner. Fulvia commanded troops against the future Augustus and is remembered as a nag who wouldn't stay in her lane. Julia the Younger may have done almost nothing at all, and was erased so thoroughly we still can't say for certain what her actual crime was. So the next time you hear one of these names dismissed as simply one of history's worst women, it's worth asking the follow-up question the sources rarely bother asking themselves. Worst by whose standard, recorded by whose hand, and preserved for whose benefit? If this walk through Rome's most dangerous, most ruthless, most misunderstood women left you with more questions than you started with, that's exactly the point. Subscribe for the next deep dive into the empire's darkest corners, and drop a comment below with which of these 11 women you think history judged the most unfairly. I read every one.